All right, so welcome back, everybody. What we are going to do over the next couple of sessions is this. We're going to finish talking about emancipation. Not that it had that much to do with anti-Semitism, but I think seeing the process of emancipation, and we kind of started it and made it through the questions posed by Napoleon to his quote-unquote Sanhedrin, that what we're going to do now is take a look at the process, or at least the expectations of Jews, and it's sort of the unwinding of a lot of the anti-Semitism. We're going to look at that briefly. We're going to look at America briefly, although we may pop back there for a little chat later on with America. America is not the most anti-Semitic place in the world by far. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time in Eastern Europe. And we're not, we'll mention some of the nice things about Eastern Europe, but only in contrast to all the crap that happened. And then we should finish off Eastern Europe next week. And then we will look at Islam and anti-Semitism, which is, considering what we're all dealing with today, with the amount of dislike that comes from that direction, it was historically not the big problem. It's just that it inherited a lot of the problems. And there was a lot of stuff already built in for people who wanted to dislike Jews. And again, to displace their anger with other things. So let's start here with this, really one of the finest, I have to go looking for the share again. Come on, there we go. One of the finest documents that we have relating to the emancipation, which is the Prussian king Wilhelm III, his edict concerning the civil status of the Jews in the Prussian state. Now, you know that Germany was made up of approximately 5,499,685,712 and a half little duchies, city-states, you name it. And at one point I was able to memorize what the number was, almost all of which had been the Holy Roman Empire. And they had a lot of things to reconcile when the Holy Roman Empire came to an end. And of course, not all of it became Germany. Some of it became a lot of it became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and other parts of Southern Europe and so forth went that direction. But we do get a pretty big Germany out of this at one point. But Prussia was always a pretty big part of it. It was outsized compared to so much of the rest of it. So it was definitely a good bellwether in terms of understanding the general drift. And the general drift was that Jews were now, by the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, were beginning to become part of the larger population and to be seen as actual citizens. But this document reminds us what it took for that to happen, which is why I'm reading it. So we, Frederick the William III, by the grace of God, King of Prussia, et cetera, having resolved to grant to the members of the Jewish faith, note that this is now a definition of the Jews as a faith. This is coming off not only the Enlightenment, but also all that has been learned from the 30 Years' War, and all that has been learned from the necessity that the Holy Roman Empire had to take upon itself at this time, earlier and afterwards, to accommodate two kinds of Christianity that had very much been at war with each other and were now seeking to be part of the same country, as the unification process, which is very complicated and is not my expertise, continued. Now, another piece of this is that many Jews had come, for reasons that we're going to look at subsequently, from Eastern Europe, had now traveled back the other direction, because Eastern Europe at this point was a misery. And we know that, and it's only going to get worse from our own family histories, if nothing else. So this is a moment, a slice of time, where there are two kinds of Jews essentially in Prussia. There are two kinds of Jews in many places: the ones that just got there, and the ones that have been there for a while that never left, or at least left and came back long before anybody remembered it. And the ones that are going to be granted citizenship, and it doesn't end anti-Semitism, but it ends so many things. They have to meet these requirements. So one of them is to understand who they are as members of a faith. And that was something that was considered quite radical. This is where the Reform movement really had a profound influence on Jewish identity, because it wasn't just the Reform Jews who had to do this. There were lots of traditional Jews left. Reform Judaism was brand new. They had a handful of synagogues, brand new. So he says, in our monarchy, a new constitution suitable to the general welfare, declare all heretofore established laws and regulations for the Jews, unless confirmed in the current edict, to be abolished, and decree as follows: Jews and their dependents dwelling at present in our states, provided with general privileges, patent letters of naturalization, letters of protection, and concessions, are considered natives, Einlander, and citizens of Prussia. So everybody who previously before had to collect some kind of, or been part of some kind of corporate status, which was the fate of the Jews throughout Europe for this entire period, now we're receiving individual status as citizens, state citizens of Prussia. The maintenance of this designation as native and state citizen is allowed, he writes, though, only under the following obligation: that they bear strictly fixed surnames. None of this Ben Moshe business. You have a last name. Now, you would think by this point, 19th century, this wouldn't have been such a problem, but the Jews were among the last to push back on this. They had often been in situations where, and this was true, I hear, too, of peasants and other folks in many different parts of Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, I suppose, too, but apparently earlier, to take on names. And that they used German or another living language, not only in keeping their commercial records, but also in the drawing of contracts and legal declarations of intention. There can't be any more of this using old Hebraic law, because the courts in Germany are not going to put up with that. If you're going to be subject to German law, to Prussian law, you better know how to write a Prussian contract. They should use only German or Latin script for their signatures. Goes on to talk about how from 6 months of the date of the edict, any individual protected or licensed Jew must declare to the authority at his place of residence the surname that he will bear, and so forth. After successfully fixing upon and declaring the surname, the individual Jew will receive from the government of the province in which he is his domicile a certificate of citizenship. This is wild. This is absolutely wild. When we talk about the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, while they very much feel like the same process, they really are two different things. Now, Jews who qualify as natives shall enjoy the same civil rights and liberties as Christians. They can hold any academic teaching and school posts, as well as municipal offices for which they're qualified. We reserve over the course of time to determine by law the extent to which the Jews might be allowed to perform other public services and state functions. Some of them were royal, and royalty was bound up with religion still, very much in Prussia as it was elsewhere. But again, they were very familiar by this point, or we're in the process of becoming familiar with the necessity of recognizing more than one religion. So funny to me that in England, this language has only been around for like one monarch. Wait, what is she now? Well, what was she? And what is he? He's defender of the faiths, plural. Whereas defender of the faith was a title given to him by the Pope before Henry, the royalty there, the monarchy there, before Henry did anything with it regarding divorce. So that's a little part of that. There were things that, even to this day, while King Charles made a big show of bringing in the clergy, they were not part of the coronation. That's what they're referring to. Native Jews will not be burdened with special taxes. They have to They have to fulfill the same civil obligations and duties toward the state and toward their municipalities as Christians. They have to pay the same taxes, with the exception of payments for Christian ceremonial services. This is a reality of Germany that goes on. There's still places in Europe that have it. It's voluntary now, but where you had to pay a religious council in the municipality or the area that you lived in for them to go about their business. You didn't join a temple or a synagogue or anything like that. You paid into a fund where sort of like if the Jewish Federation got to take a piece of the Michigan taxes and run the show. That never happened here. It did happen there, and this is a little bit aside from the subject of anti-Semitism, though it's all related because it's the different ways in which we were forced to live. When the Jews had to pay their religious councils, unlike with the Christians who had a Catholic and a Protestant one to choose from, Lutheranism and Catholicism, the Jews didn't get that because we really didn't have denominations yet. And this caused a lot of infighting. The Reform movement, though there was a town here and there where they were able to build their own synagogue, by and large, they met in people's salons. And when there was a rabbi who was a very had reform notions, because there was no reform rabbinical schools yet, and he got himself empowered at a local synagogue, he would have to wrangle with the municipality over whether he could stay or not. And a lot of times, the more frequent synagogue goers were the very traditional ones. And it goes on and on to lay out all of the conditions by which Jews have to live their lives in fairly much the same way. And I'm not going to, the last day of class, I'll send this out to everyone. I'm not going to go into every one of these things here. So this was pretty good. Keep in mind that we're talking about a place where there still weren't that many Jews. If you wanted to come to Berlin, say, from Eastern Europe, which ain't that far away, you needed to have all kinds of permits. You were not necessarily going to receive Einlander status right away, if at all. There are all kinds of books written about this, travelogues and so forth, about what it meant at that time, and we haven't gotten there. We're about to, though, to cross over from the East to the West. This isn't the East to the West of the 60s, but it's, for the Jews, a very, very strong dividing line. And there were still all kinds of differences with Jews and so forth. As it turns out, and this is definitely not part of the class, there were in the 1840s, primarily 1848, there were a series of revolutions that rose up and were put down. Jews were part of those to a certain extent. And as a result, a lot of Jews wound up leaving Central Europe. And the Eastern European Jews were still some time away from arriving. How many? It's difficult to say exactly, but most of the estimates I've read come to about 300,000 or so. That's not nothing. This is really the first entry into America of any significant Jewish population. And when they got here, they did not encounter anything like they had ever imagined back there. Now, these weren't poor Jews, or, as you can see here, necessarily horribly persecuted Jews. They had been living in many of these parts of the Holy Roman Empire, France to a lesser extent because they had been expelled and not come back in great numbers, England, the Netherlands. They'd been doing okay. They were merchants. They were citizens. But because of other events that happened that also brought in many hundreds of thousands of Germans, and related events, and somewhat unrelated events too, that brought in lots more Englishmen and lots of Scotsmen and lots of Irishmen, and all the kinds of things that we know about mid-19th century immigration to the United States, we got a lot of Jews here. And the Jews were just absolutely flabbergasted. And over the next, from 1848 until really right through the Civil Wars, although the Civil War that had a dampening effect on it. And then into the 1860s and even 70s, lots of Jews were coming here from Central Europe, not yet from Eastern Europe for a whole bunch of reasons. And where were they going? They went to areas that Jews had previously settled in very tiny numbers and had more or less vanished from. Because there were Jews here during the revolution. There were tens of thousands of Jews. That's not a lot of Jews, but they were the descendants of Jews from the Portuguese settlements that had come up from South America. In fact, the first Jews from Recife, Brazil, had come in the mid 19th century and had been rejected by Peter Stuyvesant, who had written to the which company was he working for?
Indies, West Indies?
The West Indies Company, I believe. And they said, no, you know what? These people can live there. Screw you, Pete. Ironically, a lot of Jews wound up subsequently going to Peter Stuyvesant High School into South Manhattan, including my husband, who's over here. So they had been here and they had done things here, but they had sort of just disappeared. There were too few of them, and there was too much intermarriage and too much pressure not to be Jewish, because there was a lot of pressure not to be anything but American. We had the Great Awakening. We had other things that they all made their way through. But they had left a lot of things behind: cemeteries, a synagogue here or there, a few institutions, and some number of Jews, not no Jews. Where were they? Philadelphia, significantly. That I'm now told, as of a few days ago, I hear their wonderful Jewish museum there is on the block. I hope somebody will be able to take it over. You know something about it?
Where I found the manifest for my mother and aunts came over
Wow.
in that museum.
What year was that? That
When
they came over? What year did they come over?
well, some came over in 1914. My mother came over in
All right.
1921.
So that was the Eastern European, not this immigration. So they came over here, and I don't want to dwell on them, but they founded a society that was relatively not anti-Semitic. We can talk a lot about American anti-Semitism, but I essentially leave it out of this course. And I've always left it out of this course because other than social anti-Semitism and a little bit of religious, bigotry and the same kind of shit everybody had to deal with, there's not really been any phenomena like we've seen in Eastern Europe. I don't know if I want to read this whole letter to you. I just think it's a wonderful letter. This is the letter that was written by the president, letter to the Torah Synagogue, which is still extant, by George Washington in 1790. He was making his way around. They had just we're in the middle of the Constitution, just at the end of adopting the Constitution and so forth. A lot of the language in this, as it turns out, was taken from a letter that they wrote to him first, inviting him to come. But the fact that he said these kinds of things, this is the country that most of our ancestors came to, and you can see how very different it is. But I'll just read it very quickly. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, your letter, replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. This was a really, really important moment in American Jewish history. The reflections on the days of difficulty and danger, which are past, is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we can have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages which we are now favored, we cannot fail under the just administration of a good government to become a great and happy people. This is a typical Washingtonian, that optimism that he had. He goes on to talk about what it's going to be like here for Jews. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind, not the Indians so much, examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as it was by the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, and you may know this because it was on a postage stamp, and you can probably still buy it, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So, and this, of course, he's evoking Jewish language. He knows that very well. The Jews who came over here, this was a big, a big difference to them. Things were quite a bit more welcoming here. This is where I used to end my class, but we're going to go on a little bit further, because I did not used to include too much about Eastern Europe. I would always ran out of time. And of course, it would take a long time before Jews really felt completely comfortable here. And I would argue, even with what's going on right now, the rise of the sort of misplacement of issues people have with Israel onto the Jewish people in America, let's put it that way, which I think is anti-Semitic in the way that it's being applied and certainly the way it's being experienced. Even that, it says almost nothing about how American Jews have lived here. American Jews have had a very, very good time of it here. But the majority of Jews who would be able to take advantage of that were not here yet. Certainly not in 1812 or 1790, not even in 1860 or 1870. And at those times, we had some sizable Jewish communities. New York was pretty big. Philadelphia was fairly big, was even bigger. Cincinnati, that's why the Hebrew Union College is there, had established itself as I would say the gateway to the frontier, much more so than St. Louis, the way they think about it now. And they thought of themselves as the maintainers of the European Enlightenment, because there were so many Germans there. But most of the Jews, as I've repeatedly said, were not in these good circumstances. They were back home. And so despite the things that we know about what happened in the arc of anti-Semitism important and going forward, for every Henry Ford that emerges in the 1920s and 1930s as a significant Jew hater, borrowing, by the way, from the works of the anti-Semites in Eastern Europe, or Father Coughlin, whatever his name was. People always want to correct me, like I care if I pronounce it right. The Judaism and the Jewish community was producing and had produced limitless numbers of people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who had a positive, and sometimes negative, effect on the United States. We were quite prominent here. Not so in our previous refuge. So take yourselves back several weeks now, and you recall that I spoke about the significant refuge that was provided, particularly in the Middle Ages and going just into the, I would say, the period of early Renaissance and what have you, to the Jews of everything west of Berlin and north and south, where the Jews had been before, whether it was Spain that we looked at, the 4 or 5 separate expulsions from France. What had happened in those areas was significantly horrific enough that Jews had no choice but to flee. It was flee or die. And as it happened, though there had been some little Jewish communities in Ukraine and Poland and in some other places around Lithuania, all the way down to, well, I said Ukraine. Poland, around the time of the 13th century, the 12th to 13th century, had begun what historians call their colonization process. In 1241, they were recovering from a very major war with the Mongols, which had cost them a ton of lives. Not only that, plagues and other horrible things had happened. And Jews now, joined by immigrants from other parts of Central Europe, non-Jewish parts of Central Europe, found themselves fleeing to the east. There was nobody who could stop them. It was land spreading out so far and wide. It was depopulated, and they were going to repopulate it. This is, by the way, how, and I can't understand how anybody could disagree with this, how Yiddish comes up. There's been these attempts to claim that Yiddish is a language from, I don't know, further east. It's impossible. Yiddish is, I've met too many people speaking Yiddish to German people to not understand. This is a Germanic language. We speak a Germanic language. Yiddish is way more Germanic than English is, but it's a Germanic language that over the course of years picked up a lot of its vocabulary from non-German languages, from Eastern languages, all kinds of Eastern languages, and by the way, had and always did have an enormous vocabulary of Yiddish words too. Jamie is typing in Hebrew as we speak. Not only is it written in Hebrew characters, which was, by the way, typical of other Judeo versions of languages, Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, etc., Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Arabic, but it was increasingly not as close to German because of all of the other kinds of languages that were beginning to mix in with it. And it went from being a dialect back west to being a true language of its own. I mean, linguists will argue about when does something finally become a language? And there are gradations, because you can find people arguing over whether this thing, Urdu and Hindu, whether they're different languages or not. You can find, which I always get confused of the Scandinavian languages. Is it Norwegian and Swedish that are almost the same language? It just really is dependent upon. I'm probably saying that one wrong. The Jews were especially welcome because they had things that other immigrant groups did not offer. They weren't Christians to begin with, and that was an advantage because it meant that they could produce income from income. They could sell you money. I mean, that's what it is after all, right? They're selling you money, and they did a lot of that. By the 1260s, a group of the nobles of Poland had begun to issue their own documents of protection for Jews that were coming in, and these, unlike the ones that had been given and often taken back in Central, Southern, Western, and so forth, Northern Europe, these came with extra rights, including the ability to become businessmen, to own land. Casimir, who was the big guy in that area, ratified most of these, extended it to include specific points of protection from Christians. He was well aware of what had happened further east and why they had come there, including prosecuting anybody who desecrated a Jewish cemetery or who made false blood libel accusations against Jews. Freedom of worship and assembly was given to the Jews. And the Jewish community grew. It grew very, very, very large. I always forget to write this down, but it was well over 90% of the Jews in the world were living in Eastern Europe by the 1700s. That is just a remarkable amount of natural growth, no longer immigration. The Jews had a sense of autonomy there. There was something called the Council of the Four Lands that the Lithuanian Polish Confederacy had put together in order to, in order to be part of their larger sort of strange, I don't want to call it democratic, but representative kind of government, where they elected their rulers, but not with the people, just the aristocrats. But still different than the absolute monarchies that we saw further to the west. In the 14th century already, there was beginning to be grumbling, and it shouldn't surprise us. The 1300s had, the Black Death for one, which did not help the Jews. But anti-Jewish riots begin to break out all through these areas in the 1400s, the 1500s, but it was the 16th and 17th century that really saw the flowering, because the Jews were able to overcome this mostly by the nobility assisting them. And this is when the Golden Age took place. Yiddish language, which I've already explained to you where it comes from. I didn't explain Aramaic as part of it. Aramaic, we were at the Chaldean Museum yesterday with the kids from Spinoza learning about the very, very ancient roots of Hebrew and Babylonian. Chaldean Aramaic is the language that they spoke, which is the language of our Talmud. And of course, every kind of Slavic language in one big stew. The Jews in the center of all of this, in Poland and Lithuania, became more and more, through this Council of Four Lands, united, and many more were attracted to come, even from the outer areas. And the Polish nobility and the landowners and the Jewish merchants, they began to own many business enterprises. They were involved in import-export, which was very important in Europe. They were running mills and distilleries. That would keep on for a long time. The Jewish role in running bars, for instance. Well, they didn't call them bars, but lodges, but places for drinking. They were living like kings. When ultimately there was a little mini revolution that took place within the Jewish population, something that could only have been afforded by the fact that they were doing so well. It was a revolution against their own leaders. Oh, I'm sorry, Ron, I missed you. What were you going to ask? Put us back. We can't hear you.
I wanted to show a picture accenting what you're talking about, Jeff.
Oh, please.
This is the town insignia of Kolbashova, where my family is from, in Galicia. And it's quite striking. This dates back to the 1790s. We visited Kolbashova several years ago and discovered this among looking for burial grounds and old family mementos and places important to grandparents and so on and so forth. But this was the most striking thing that I carried away with me, because they proudly display it today in a town with no Jews or one Jew. I know a person who was spending several months there doing a research project in the town, a Jew. But it's quite striking. There are memories of the Jews there. The old synagogue is intact. The cemetery has been desecrated. But in any case, it's in their consciousness.
Very much so. That's what
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I remember you showed me that once. That's terrific. Oh, you did a presentation on your trip there.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and indeed, particularly in the 15th, 16th, 17th century into the 18th century, things were going very, very well for the Jews. It's almost a 350-year period, much longer than the Golden Age of Spain for the Jews, because that really was just 150, 200 years. And this is where the blooming and blossoming of so much Jewish literature happened. I mean, when you go into these Jewish bookstores and you see not just the Talmud, but you see a million different commentaries and all kinds of other what have you on the walls of these bookstores, these Sepharim stores, wherever you may be, New York or here or Jerusalem for sure. You get a sense of how much things have flourished. And what I was about to mention, you gave me a better segue than I had, was this actually caused a little revolt. Things were so good that Jews would sometimes rebel against each other on exactly the kinds of things you would think that a free-ish group of people might do. And one of them was educational. A lot of the Jews, for instance, felt that the educational system had become quite frozen. And they had the luxury, because they were not under constant persecution, of raising up their own little spiritual upheaval. And of course, I'm talking about the Hasidim, which were primarily a Lithuanian, northern phenomenon, but absolutely spread south to Ukraine. There are a number of notable Ukrainian sects of Hasidism today. And we think of Hasidism, we have like 3 or 4, maybe 5 major ones in our heads. There's hundreds of them, hundreds of courts. So I'm just going to go ahead and just okay, it's working now. All right. And a lot of people look up what they wear, and they wonder, what is this all from? And I'm not talking about Chabad. Get Chabad out of your mind. Chabad wears what they wore in 1947 in New York. There's not a damn bit of difference. Same hat, same pants, same coat. That was their golden era. The rest of the Hasidim, I'm talking about the ones with the streimels and the white stockings and the shiny, almost pilgrim-looking shoes. Those folks were dressing as the nobility of Poland. That's how they viewed the nobility of Poland. It was for them the classiest you could be. And they were ushering through spiritual revolutions at the same time. So this was a good period. But this period, of course, was bound to end. And it ended with quite a crash. And it was never going to be the same again. This is the beginning of the end. The end of 1600s, Poland and Lithuania got involved in all kinds of wars. One of them with Sweden, which, I know that's hard to imagine today, but they weren't all singing ABBA music back then. Another with Russia, notably. And the one with Russia was the one that had the biggest effect. But the one with Russia was joined in by Kazakhs and others in the south. Notably, in 1648-49, a man named, I always say it wrong, but it's as close as I can get to it, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I hope most of you have probably heard of him. He was a supporter of the Tatar Khan, who was the ruler of Crimea. And I imagine we can all picture these things now, at least in the last few years, without having to look it up on a map. And he roused local peasants to fight with him and the Russian Orthodox Cossacks against the Jews and the Polish and other Ukrainian Catholics, which is why symbols like that probably were also demonstrating civil, military even, support for each other, that they saw themselves as allies that way. They committed enormous violence. And this is a great map of some of the places where it happened. And in many cases, it started here in the Dnieper Valley. It started over accusations of blood libel. And then it continued with war being made on the Polish gentry, who were the allies of the Jews. And it just denigrated from there. He is still considered today to be the great national hero of Ukraine, which even in the current circumstances where many of us support Ukraine and so forth for modern reasons and reasons going back to this, it's a little bit difficult to view their admiration of Khmelnytsky, knowing that what for Jews that meant. It was a huge loss of life for Jews, and it was really the end of, because of the entry of Russia into the scene, just as they have entered the scene today. It was the beginning of the end of this. So, the southern area here would be brought in. Lithuania, Poland over here would fall. The entire political makeup of the area was transformed. We don't know how many Jews died. There's a lot of historical discussion about this, but it does seem that it had to have been at least 100,000, and estimates of 200,000, I don't feel are exaggerated. This is considered the beginning of the period of the age of pogroms. And this is how it started. So I want to read with you a little passage here. Again, some say that it might be a little bit exaggerated, but I don't think so, based on at least the historians that I studied with. This is a writing by somebody named Nathan Hanover, Natan Hanover, We know very little about him. He wasn't famous because he was a rabbi. He was famous because they found this work. The work had been completed in 1652, and it was called The Abyss of Despair. He lived in Volhynia. I should have pulled down the map again, but I'm leave it there. When the attacks by the Cossacks, primarily led by Khmelnytsky, started, he fled to Prague, he went to Venice, and he mostly stayed in Italy after that. This is what he says happened that sort of sparked the revolt. And you can see here the relationships between the Polish gentry and the Jews that's about to go down the toilet with the Polish gentry. Well, any Polish magnates notice Khmel's successes. That's what he calls them, Khmel, to be merciful to me. They too rebelled against the Kingdom of Poland and allied with him, promising him the same loyalty they had shown the King of Poland, who was elected king, by the way. Among these was the captain ordered to execute Khmel, who Khmel then made captain of his own forces. Also, the former secretary and scribe to General Konipolski, now deceased, became Khmel's scribe. So he goes on with this for a little bit, and what he's really meaning to explain to us is what happened when the nobility just sort of folded. They just crumbled. Most of who was left joining up. So continue here. On the same day, the Polish army and its generals were captured. News arrived of King Władysław's death, that's the Polish king, leaving the kingdom now, the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, leaderless. This had been a major, major kingdom at one point. Extraordinarily successful place, which is why the Jews did well there. It was good times for everybody, and the Jews were part of that. The nobility and the common people were disheartened upon hearing of their king's death and the capture of their nobles and generals. The Jewish community's courage dissolved in fear of the enemy. They had nothing to hold on to other than what was granted them by the giant majority. The Jewish, whereas Duke Wisniewski, remembered as a friend to the Jews and unmatched as a warrior, was stationed beyond the Dnieper, the river I just showed you. He led about 500 Jewish families to safety, protecting them from danger. The Jewish communities learned of these terrible events on the first day of Shavuot, so that's the early summer. They fled, leaving behind their valuables, driven by the instinct to survive. The atrocities committed against those who couldn't escape were horrific. Some were flayed alive, others dismembered or buried alive. Infants were slaughtered in front of their mothers. The 4 capital punishments, stoning, burning, decapitation, and strangulation, were all inflicted upon the Jews. And this is, again, where we're not sure how much of this is exaggeration and how much is true. There are not many of these diaries that exist for us to check against. But then again, there were a lot of people, including myself, who thought that the reports of what happened on October 7th were exaggerated, only to learn that what happened on October 7th was much worse than even I imagined it could be. So people are capable of doing this, and Jews have always been convenient targets. After these events, the Tartars returned home with their loot, and Khmel, along with his forces, entered Chezhrin to celebrations. Khmel then sought to secure his position by advising peace with the Polish nobles while secretly preparing for further conflict. The Jewish and Polish communities, forewarned by friendly Ukrainians and their own spies, prepared for the worst, uniting in solidarity. Just to finish it up, Khmel attempted to make peace with the Polish nobles. It did not work. They remembered how brutally he had been to them, and the entire thing fell apart. The country was now gone. Russia took its place, and the beginnings of some very, very, very bad times for the Jews, much worse than anything they had experienced ever, because of the large numbers of them now that this encompassed began. There's just a little map of what happened from 1772 to 1815. Now look at the comparison here or the geographical adjacency, I guess you could call it, between East Prussia, right? I mean, Berlin's just over here a little ways, where my thing runs off the screen. This is basically what's left of Poland in here. Russia is advancing forward over these many years and finally will rush all the way here. And so you have East Prussia, where Jews are flourishing in small numbers compared to the numbers, the hundreds of thousands, millions who live in here. And ultimately, This is the area that will be established as a limited place for Jews, the Pale of Settlement, which you've undoubtedly heard of. More than 1.2 million Polish and Lithuanian Jews were incorporated into Russian rule. That included thousands of Jews who had been expelled earlier in the 1720s, who now found themselves back under. These were Jews who had moved west, as opposed to our normative eastward fleeing that we'd seen. They had moved west in the late 18th, mid 18th century, when things were bad in Russia for Jews, and now found themselves under Russian rule as the Russians took over Belarus. That's why Russia up here. And here, for instance, are some of the very famous and iconic areas where Jews lived and will continue to live inside the Pale. This area here is generally considered the Pale of Settlement. I don't know if I have a map of it here. I do have a map of it here. We'll look at it in a minute. Here's Minsk, for instance. Here's Vilna. My former father-in-law of blessed memory, he was from a little town near Vilna. We know a lot about his town because they wrote a book this big about their memories after they managed to survive the Holocaust. And by the way, the only reason they survived the Holocaust was because of Zionism. They were a Zionist town, and they encouraged all the children to make Aliyah there, to go to Israel as quick as they could. And 1/3 of his family did it. And the other ones just were very lucky because when Poland was divided in 1941 between Russia and USSR and Germany, they found themselves just here on the USSR side and spent the war making munitions for the Soviets in a labor camp, where they were kind of free to come and go, if they could find anywhere to go. So here's where the Jews were, all of this area. And in 1835, between 1835 and 1917, primarily in the 1880s, the Jews living in the rural areas of the Pale were forced to leave their towns, and they were reorganized in the shtetls all throughout the Pale. The shtetls are not these lovely places that we see in the hold on, let me get to my that we see in the movies like Fiddler on the Roof. They were not fun, gorgeous places. They were places of disease. They were places of poverty. All Jews wanted to do was get out of there. And these were the various areas as far west as Kalisz, Warsaw here, Minsk, the province now of Minsk, of Vilna, of Kovno. This is where the Galicianers were, down here. And this is where the Jews were living when the pogroms of 1882 to 1883 began to break out. These were the areas they were forced to leave. St. Petersburg, Novgorod, Smolensk, Moscow, of course, Tula, Voronezh, Kursk, Kharkov, major Jewish populations, all forced into this area. Very much a model for what Hitler would do in the early 1940s. Keep in mind, Hitler did not plan the final solution to be the extermination of the Jews. He didn't think he was going to wind up with millions of Jews. He didn't think about it even, with millions of Jews under his rule. He just assumed they'd leave. He always was assuming they'd leave. I don't know if you know this. Hitler made it easy for people to leave Germany. I don't know if you guys realize this. Hitler made it to 300,000 Jews. I'm not going to talk about the Holocaust a lot more today, but 300,000 Jews in Germany, 1% of the population. Hitler did not make it hard to leave. In fact, he set up, and there's eyewitnesses to this from the people who did it, he set up agencies where you could go, Jews could line up and get every single stamp that they needed to get out of the country. And it was run with Germanic efficiency. And guess why they couldn't get out? Because their last stamp was unavailable. The one that America could have provided, the one that Cuba could have provided, the one that anybody else in the country, in the world needed to provide, that last rubber stamp. Don't get me going. This is where anti-Semitism becomes very, very bad. And we're going to see a little bit next time from what happened here, why Zionism became so popular. Audrey.
Did that ever stop? I mean, was that all through the war? When did it change?
When it became very clear, it became very clear to Hitler very early on that his problem with his own Jews meant that they were going to have to be collected up in as many places as possible, in concentration camps. But these were not yet death camps. His 300,000 Jews were an afterthought when you look at the numbers of Jews that were killed. They had every opportunity to leave. And many of them, by the way, did leave. The ones who could leave did leave. But by many, what do we mean? Tens of thousands, 100,000? It wasn't the majority. Germany had a tiny Jewish population, 1%, less than half per capita that the United States has.
But was that the problem all through the war, or was that?
Once Germany invaded all these other countries, more and more Jews came under his control. Now, when he was going west, it wasn't enormous numbers. It wasn't overwhelming numbers. So the Jews were being taken and they were being moved east, but there was no program yet for the destruction of the Jews. It wasn't on the docket. They just assumed the Jews would ultimately leave or they would die in these camps or what have you. What happens though, because these are small numbers of Jews, relatively speaking, and some of them are escaping, but the escaping has to be not from the clutches of the Germans. Early on, the escaping was to the places that wouldn't give them visas to arrive. We know this. The Bermuda Conference was meant to divide up the numbers of German Jews and other Western Jews, but mostly German Jews who the West would take. And they all pledged to take people, and they all know nobody took anybody. To get a visa to come to this country was nearly impossible. You needed to be on some kind of program for scholars, for people with lots of extra talents, and so forth, very much like today. But now he comes in, it wasn't that late in the war, where he turns his attention from the West to the East when he gets frustrated with not being able to take England. England could absolutely boggled his mind. Nobody expected England to survive that war. And they did. Don't get me going on England. I know a lot of people don't agree with me, but I think that what England did in World War II will forgive centuries of anything else that they ever did. They willingly gave up their own empire to say no to a country that was willing to let them keep it in its entirety. So what do they do? He moves eastward. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right, which he's taken over all this land, he breaks it. And now what happens? Not only does he have all the Jews that were in the parts of Poland that he was already struggling to deal with, that he was putting in concentration camps, that he was killing through Einsatzgruppen as he made his murderous way through there, but then he wound up in all the towns where, like, my father-in-law and his family lived. And it doubled and tripled. I don't remember. I don't want to say a certain amount because I don't know. But it definitely increased the burden. The Wannsee Conference, I just want to check this real quick because I don't want to give you the wrong year. I wasn't going to do too much on the Holocaust, so I didn't write too many numbers down. But are you all familiar with the Wannsee Conference? The Wannsee Conference took place in 1942. Yeah, 1942. It was after they had gotten so many Jews that they needed an actual plan for what to do with it. So they meet in this beautiful house on this beautiful lake in Berlin, and they decide to plan the Holocaust. And they put it together with absolute German precision. January 20th, 1942. There's a movie that was made. Now it's 30 years old. There's a movie that was made about the Wannsee Conference that anybody wants to understand how the final solution became the final solution has to see. It's a condensed, but almost word for word uh, reduction of the of Heydrich, who was the man, Reinhard Heydrich, who was the man who essentially planned it, of what he did. This was all made necessary to the Germans by this point because of the fact that they were taking on more and more Jews, and they didn't know what to do with them. The Warsaw Ghetto got so full that they started to track them away. That's why Auschwitz comes into play. Not that Jews weren't dying before that. A lot of Jews were dying before that. People always ask me the numbers, and I know how I'm terrible with numbers, but you can look them up. It's not hard to find. But the necessity now of trying to get rid of as many as possible, as quickly as possible, becomes pressing after the invasion of the USSR and the breaking of the treaty. And why are all those Jews there? They're all there because of the Pale of Settlement. They're there because the Russians had forced them into these places. But I got very, very much ahead of myself, because what I want to do next time is just very briefly talk about some of the pogroms that took place there, the effect that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion had on stoking Jew hatred, though it really didn't need to. It became a very powerful source of it. And why this then led to two phenomena. One, this completely ridiculous idea that the Jews could return to Israel, which hardly any did, by the way. It was a very tiny phenomenon. People will talk about, oh, but the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration was never in effect, and if it was in effect, it was for like 20 minutes. The most famous quote by Chaim Weizmann, the famous British chemist who went on to be the first president of Israel. Am Yisrael Ayeka. People of Israel, where the hell are you? Where are you? They weren't coming. Where did they come? We know where they came. They came here. That's why we're all here. That's why there's 6 million Jews here today. They went there later. That's why the other half of the Jewish people lives there. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me. I'm going to go watch the sky, the Jews blot out the sky, the sun from the sky.